we're looking at Rachel and Leah. And of course, these two are sisters. As a result of everything, they both end up being Jacob's wives. Not only these two, but two others. Just the way things have worked out here. Not necessarily according to God's plan, but God was able to work with what was happening here and bring about His plan in Jacob's life. The devotional is Idols in the Land, Genesis 31, 34, and 35. And that says, Now Rachel had taken the images and put them in the camel's furniture and set upon them, and Laban searched all the tent, but found them not. And she said to her father, Let it not displease my Lord, that I cannot rise up before thee, for the custom of women is upon me. And he searched, but found not the image. And evidently these were idols. These were false gods. These were images that Laban had. And Rachel had taken them without her father's permission. And of course, the story, Jacob was leaving Laban, but Laban went after it's supposed to see how much energy Jacob was willing to exert to find these. And it's almost like his faith and trust was in the image more than it was. Somebody got an emergency? Sorry about that. Okay. Anyway, so the application is the student will conclude that God is always leading him. And when he follows God, he will be a blessing to others. And that just goes without saying. So many times we don't think God is working fast enough. But God doesn't work on our timetable. And we just need to learn to be patient. The first thing he says here is change the unforgiving constant of life. It doesn't matter. Things are going to change. We live from day to day, and as the days fade into years, we may think that life is settled. But no matter how long we have been in one situation, there are changes in our future. Jacob lived in Bethuel with Laban for 20 years. During those years, he married Leah and Rachel and had 12 children, 11 boys and 1 girl. He also became a prosperous herdsman. Jacob may have thought that his future was in Bethuel, but in his heart he knew that he belonged in the land of Canaan. In spite of many years he had lived in Haran, his home was in the land God had given to his grandfather. Interestingly, 20 years had passed, and Isaac, Esau, and Rebekah were still alive. When Jacob fled his uncle's home, the family thought that Isaac was dying. This is one of the reasons Jacob stole the birthright, or the blessing, from Esau. Now it was time for Jacob to leave his uncle's house and build his own future. God's plan had always been to bring Jacob back into the land of Canaan. God made that promise to Jacob at Bethel, when Jacob was fleeing with only his staff. God has a plan for every one of his children. That plan may take many years to fully implement. Jacob worked 14 years to earn the privilege of marrying his 2 wives. After he decided to go back to Canaan, it was another 6 years during which God made him wealthy enough to return home. We should never become impatient when God does not answer our prayers according to our time schedule. And it's almost like sometimes it's like, hurry up, God, hurry up, God. But God knows what He's doing, and God can see things that we can't. And that's the amazing thing about trusting God is He can see the future. He knows what the future is. He's already in tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day. He's already working things out for our good. So not necessarily everything we want, but He's working things out for our good, and He's always looking out for our good. So we look in the Scripture here, and the first portion of Scripture is taken from Genesis 30, 1 through 13. Now, the entire lesson is based on Genesis chapter 30 through 33. You can read those for yourself. But we'll look at the Scripture that's printed in the quarterly here. Genesis 30, 1 through 13. And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister, and said unto Jacob, Give me children, or else I die. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, Am I in God's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? And she said, Behold, my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I may have children by her. And she gave him Bilhah, her handmaid, to wife. And Jacob went in unto her, and Bilhah conceived and bare Jacob a son. And Rachel said, God hath judged me, and hath also heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Therefore called she his name Dan. And Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again, and bare Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, With great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed, and she called his name Naphtali. When Leah saw that she had left bearing, she took Zilpah her maid, and gave her to Jacob to wife. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a son. And Leah said, A troop cometh, and she called his name Gad. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a second son, and Leah said, Happy am I, for the daughters will call me blessed. And she called his name Asher. Tell you what, some of this is almost like reading the life story of some people in present day. Here he says, the commentator says, a big family is not necessarily a happy family. These verses record the enmity and jealousy in Jacob's family. Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah. He never intended to marry Leah, but the trickster was tricked, and he was stuck in this situation. Leah began to have children, and in a relatively short time, she gave birth to Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. She thought that her husband would love her because she had borne him these children. However, Jacob felt about these children and Leah. The fact that Leah had children and Rachel did not provoke jealousy in the heart of Rachel. This became such a serious issue with Rachel that she told her husband she would die if she did not have a baby. Jacob wisely knew that babies were a gift from God, and he told Rachel that this matter was in the hands of God. Rachel was not content with the answer, and she proposed that Jacob father a child by her handmaid, Bilhah, and then the baby could be given to her. This shows the desperation in the heart of this woman. Jacob complied, and Dan was born as a result of this union with Bilhah. The process was repeated, and this resulted in the birth of Naphtali. Sin has unexpected consequences, and now Leah became jealous of Rachel. She gave her maid, Zilpah, to Jacob, and the result was the birth of Gad. Zilpah had a second son and named him Asher. Are you confused yet? Now Jacob was the father of 8 sons, 4 by Leah, 2 by Bilhah, 2 by Zilpah. Later Leah will have 2 more sons, Issachar and Zebulun, and a daughter, Dinah. Rachel will have 2 children of her own. First, Joseph, and she will die during the birth of Benjamin. Jacob had 13 children, 12 boys and 1 girl, by 4 different women. We can see how the seeds of strife and division were sown in this family from the beginning. And it's absolutely right. These were people that were trying to, hurry God along. Rachel wanted children. She didn't understand, and she thought she would die if she didn't have children. Her sister was having children, and she couldn't. And of course, Jacob says, it's not in my hands. This is in God's control. And there's a lot of things in life that we need to understand are in God's control. They're not in our control. God, in His own time, will bless and will answer as He sees fit, not as we see fit. Jacob's desire to go home. And it came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said unto Laban, Send me away, that I may go unto mine own place and to my country. Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served thee, and let me go, for thou knowest my service which I have done thee. And Laban said unto him, I pray thee, if I have found favor in thine eyes, tarry, for I have learned by experience that the Lord hath blessed me for thy sake. Laban wanted him to stick around because the Lord was blessing him because Jacob was there. He wanted him to tarry for a while. But we know all of this was according to God's plan. It was time for Jacob to go. When Joseph was born, Jacob decided to return to the land of his fathers. Out of respect to his father-in-law, he asked to be allowed to return and take his family with him. This was 6 years before he actually departed. Laban realized that his life had been blessed since Jacob came into his home. God had promised Abraham he would bless those who blessed him. Laban was an example of this blessing, and Laban knew it. He told Jacob plainly that he had learned that lesson. In order to fairly distribute the wealth of the household, Laban and Jacob agreed that Jacob would get the cattle, sheep, goats, camels that were multicolored. Laban would keep those that were solid colored. When this agreement was made, most of the animals were one solid color. Multicolored animals were relatively rare. So Laban readily agreed to this arrangement. The herds were separated by 3 days' journey so that an accurate accounting could be made. Over the next several years, most of the animals that were born were multicolored, and Jacob increased in wealth greatly. According to Genesis 31, God had told him what to do, and Jacob followed God's instructions. God had promised to bless Jacob at Bethel, and God kept that promise. Laban had agreed to Jacob's terms, and he could do nothing about the result. Over the years, Laban saw his herd decrease and Jacob's increase. When Jacob arrived 20 years before, all he had was his staff. Jacob worked hard and endured hardships and trusted God. Now he had large flocks, a large family, and servants to care for all his animals. Importantly, none of Jacob's wealth was a result of the blessing of Isaac. The birthright that had been such a bone of contention played no part in Jacob's financial success. At the end of 6 years, Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude had changed. Laban's selfish heart was revealed. When Jacob was the means of increasing his wealth, Laban was happy to have him around. Now Jacob's wealth had increased, and Laban's wealth had decreased. Laban no longer looked at Jacob as he once had. Jacob noticed this change, and this confirmed that it was time for Jacob to leave. And sometimes God gives us telltale signs about what we need to do, and this was a telltale sign of telling Jacob that it was time for him to leave and go back to his land, the land that was promised to Abraham. And you remember the covenant, or the covenant that he made with God, that if God would take care of him and lead him and guide him and then bring him back to his home. And so God is fulfilling what he said he would do. Even though Jacob had made mistakes and Jacob had done some things to try to hurry up, answer to prayer as far as Rachel was concerned and everything else, but not unlike what Abraham did and not unlike what Isaac did. So, anyway, he learned some pretty hard lessons. But he came out a wiser man because he came out trusting God. That's the important thing in life, is that we learn to trust God. Sometimes that takes a while. The Prince of God, and he said unto him, What is thy name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. Jacob left without ceremony. Jacob was gone for 3 days before Laban knew about it. This is significant. Before they departed, Rachel stole her father's household gods, the images that had been in her house since she was born. Laban pursued Jacob and caught up with Jacob at Gilead. God came to Laban in a dream and warned him not to speak to Jacob, either for good or bad. Laban ignored this warning and confronted Jacob. Laban accused Jacob of stealing his gods. It is clear that none of this was sincere. Jacob allowed Laban to make a search for his gods and to kill whoever had stolen them. Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen the images. Laban searched the camp and did not find the images. Rachel had hidden them in the camel's saddle, and she was sitting on it when her father came to search. Jacob then exposed the miserly ways of his father-in-law. Jacob had worked for Laban for 20 years, and Laban had changed his wages 10 times. Jacob knew that if God had not helped him, he would have left Haran with nothing. To resolve this matter, Jacob and Laban made a stone monument, and each one agreed to stay on his side of this border. In this way, these two very different men, Laban, the material idol worshiper, and Jacob, the Prince of God, parted ways. After dealing with Laban, Jacob turned his attention to reconciliation with his brother Esau. He began by sending messengers to Esau, who by this time had settled in Edom. The messengers told Esau of Jacob's wealth and of his desire to return to Canaan and live in peace with his brother. Esau responded by coming to meet Jacob, accompanied by an army of 400 men. Jacob was afraid of what Esau might do, and he divided those that were with him into 2 groups, so that if one was destroyed, the other would survive. Then Jacob wisely prayed about this situation. Jacob acted prudently here. He took precautions by dividing the people that were with him, and then he wisely appealed to God for help. Jacob did not want to fight with his brother, and he sought every way possible to avoid a conflict. Jacob put himself in God's care and depended on God to protect his family from Esau. He declared that he was a sinner and that he was not worthy of the mercies of God. Jacob was not trying to trick God or bargain with God. He was throwing himself on the mercy of God. Then he was thankful for all that God had given him in the past. He had left Canaan with nothing but his staff, and now he had enough to divide into 2 companies of people and animals. Jacob asked God to deliver him from the wrath of Esau. He was afraid that Esau would kill him and then kill his wives and children. Jacob claimed the promises of God, remembered the goodness of God, and then trusted in the providence of God for his deliverance. This kind of prayer prevails. Jacob offered a valuable present to Esau and declared that he would meet with his brother personally the next day. That night, an angel came and wrestled with Jacob. During that confrontation, Jacob realized that there was more to a good life than physical wealth. He also needed the abiding presence of God. He had the blessing from his father Isaac. Now he also wanted a blessing from God. In obtaining that blessing, the angel asked Jacob his name. He replied, Jacob, and God changed the name of Jacob, which means trickster, to Israel, which means Prince of God. From now on, this would be the name of the man and the nation that came from his family. Even in all of this confusion, all of these many different lives and many different children, we see God working his plan out. In the summary here, or the final word, it says, when he returned to Canaan, Jacob had grown materially and spiritually. When he first desired to return to his home, he was practically a servant to his father-in-law. By following the specific instructions of God, Jacob became wealthy during the next few years. When he finally returned to Canaan, he was not forced to deal with the family problems that he left behind when he fled to Bethel. He faced these old troubles with wisdom and prayer, and God was with him. We can run away from our problems, but they will be waiting for us when we go back home. When Jacob came back into the land, Isaac, Rebekah, and Esau were all still alive. By the grace of God and the providence of God, Jacob, now named Israel, was able to resolve his conflicts and take his place as a successor to the promises made to his grandfather Abraham. Israel was not free from all problems, and he would face many personal troubles in the days ahead. However, he had learned the important lesson that when trouble comes, he must turn everything he had over to the Lord and follow his instructions completely. God can and will deliver us when we will dedicate ourselves to fulfilling the plan God has for our lives. Wow. 13 children that he had, but by 4 different women. It's never God's desired plan, but God was able to work even through this plan. And we see how that God has worked in many places in the Old Testament in various situations where it was not according to God's will exactly how things happened, but God was able to take those things and use them for the good. The life of David was filled with things. You know, the paramount thing that we all think about is the killing of Uriah, taking Bathsheba, Uriah's wife, and things of this nature. And then David realizing what he had done and hiding himself in a cave, and it wasn't until the man of God came and spoke to him, and he realized what he had done. And even though God forgave him, he told him that there would never be peace in his house anymore. And I have to say that there were differences between these 12 children, because as we will see a little bit later, what they did to Joseph. And these brothers all had the same father, but they had different moms. And that made them different. They were not the same exact biological makeup as if they had all had the same mom and dad. And so this always causes controversy. And I know when a man who has children and a woman who has children, and they decide to come together, and then maybe as they are blessed, then they have some children of their own together, it seems like every time it comes down to yours, mine, and ours. And the ones that are the man's children kind of resent the ones that are the woman's children, and the woman's children resent the ones that are the man's children, because they just can't see it. And it's teaching all of the time when you have situations like that. But on the other hand, I've known people, large families, who were all of the same biological parents, and they still had issues. So, there are no guarantees, but God desired it to be one man and one woman, not one man and many women. And I had a guy ask me several years ago, he said, how come it's wrong to have more than one wife? And you look in the Old Testament and you see all these guys that had more than one wife. And I said, well, look, everywhere there was more than one woman, there was always trouble. And it would have been the same. It would have been the same if it had been one woman and many men. It just goes against God's design. I think Jacob learned a very important lesson, that God was more important, and that seeking God's will and seeking His advice and trusting Him was more important than even material wealth or anything else. What Rachel did was not right. You would think when they told him to go back to Laban's house, I don't know if Abraham knew or if Isaac knew that Laban worshiped these little gods. I don't know if they knew that or not. But it was all revealed here as you find them dealing with Jacob. And then Rachel takes them, and then Laban changes. And you notice something very interesting, what Laban was doing, and he does like a lot of worldly people do. Everything was good, and he began to realize that he was increasing and God was blessing because Jacob was there. So he was becoming a little more affluent, he was becoming a little richer. But then toward the end, he had changed his wages 10 times. 10 times during this period of 20 years. And he tricked him from the beginning because he said it's not right to give the younger daughter before the older daughter is wed. And so Jacob was tricked into marrying Leah and then later Rachel, but having to work 14 years for the privilege of this. And so we see that Laban was kind of he's like a lot of worldly people. Everything is about what we can have in this world, not realizing that we're not going to be here forever. Abraham was the one who was looking for the city not made with hands. And his faith was a great example, so much so that it was imputed to him for righteousness because he trusted God, even though he made mistakes. Isaac was a man of faith, but issues. And we find Jacob here the same. He has some of the similar issues. A wife that couldn't have children, and she gives her handmaid because she envies her sister who was able to give him children. And so they give their handmaids, and so he fathers children by the handmaids. He takes them to wives. So he ends up with 4 wives here that gave him 13 children. And God was still able to bless. And 12 male children are the 12 tribes of Israel. And he changed his name to Israel, and this is the name of the nation of God's chosen people. So God was in the process of bringing about his chosen people, even in the lives of all of these, because of the covenant he made with Abraham, because of the one he made with Isaac, which was kind of a recounting of the one he made with Abraham, and then the one that he made with Jacob. And we see all through this that God had kept his promises. Laban, on the other hand, did not keep all of his promises. He changed his wages 10 times. He made him work all of this time. He received the increase of his herd and his flocks and everything else for a time. But in the end, God increased Jacob, and so Jacob increased and Laban decreased. Now, I don't know that if Laban really lost some stuff in the decrease, or it was just the fact that Jacob was increasing to the point where he didn't have to be Laban's servant anymore. And so Laban kind of resented that. He wanted to keep him around as long as God was blessing and he was getting a little richer. And there's a lot of people that use other people that way. They want to keep certain people around because they're making them good money. And that's about all they want. That's about all they care about. And when that seems to run out, then they have no more use for them. They can go on down the road. And it's really sad to treat people that way. So, Rebecca took Laban's little statues, little figurines or little gods, and Laban came and accused Jacob, and Jacob said, "Search. Go ahead, look." And he found them. He didn't find them anywhere. But Jacob did not know Rachel took them and that she was sitting on them that were in the saddle. So it was a very touchy situation. But when it's all said and done, God receives the honor and the glory. And that's the key here. And Jacob grew. He matured. He became the man that God needed him to be, wanted him to be. So we find in our lives that there comes a point when we mature and we grow and we see things a little bit differently. We're not as invincible as we once were. We realize that we never were invincible. It was only that God had mercy on us, that we weren't taken out earlier. And when you're young and, as they say, dumb, you think you know nothing can touch you. But that's not true. So, that's the lesson for the 17th.